Namaskar and welcome to Sansad Television. I am Vishal Dahiya and you're watching our special show Perspective, where we bring you detailed analysis of national and international issues. Now today we're going to talk about the US-China relationship and specifically the Biden-Xi virtual summit. Now, US President Joe Biden and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping met virtually on Monday and discussed the complex nature of relations between both the countries and the importance of managing competition responsibly. According to a White House handout on the meeting, President Biden underscored that the United States will continue to stand up for its interests and values and together with its allies and partners ensure the rules of the road for the 21st century and advance an international system that is free, open and fair. He also raised concerns about China's practices in Xinjiang, Tibet and Hong Kong, as well as human rights more broadly. Indo Pacific also came up for discussion during the meeting, with the US President reiterating the importance of freedom of navigation and safe overflight to the region's prosperity. According to China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Xi Jinping emphasized the necessity of a sound and steady relationship between the two countries. The Chinese leader also expressed his readiness to work with President Biden to build consensus and take active steps to move China-US relations forward in a positive direction. Now, to further understand and analyze all aspects of this complex relationship between US and China, we have with us a distinguished panel of guests today. Let me first introduce them to you, beginning with, I have with me in the studio Professor Dr. Shriram Cholia. He's Dean of Jindal School of International Affairs. Welcome, Dr. Cholia. We are also joined by two more guests. Elizabeth Broy is joining us. She's a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. And former Ambassador Meera Shankar is also joining us today. Welcome, all of you, to Sansad TV. Let me begin with you, Dr. Cholia, and let's first start by understanding the contours of this complex relationship. Some points which I have mentioned in the introduction, but it goes beyond that as well. There is a lot of posturing happening between US and China for quite some time now.
Yeah, Vishal, I mean, it's a big powers, two major powers, and for them to have a 3.5-hour-long virtual meeting shows the number of issues that have piled up. And complex is in many ways an understatement. I think essentially it's a conflicted relationship and one which has intense competition, rivalry, and ultimately, I think great powers that are quite different in terms of their value systems. You could see that in the summit, the points Biden was raising and the rebuttals that Xi Jinping was making. It was quite clear that they disagreed much more than they agreed on many things. But, like even during the Cold War period, when the Soviet Union and the US were competing, there was the so-called strategic stability. The idea that they will keep the communication lines open, but continue to tussle. So it's not like this is going to lead to some kind of a golden era or an improvement in relations. I think that this is more, like you said, one of it is to show the world that each side is responsible and we are not, triggering this new Cold War. The other side has to behave responsibly. So I think a lot of it, in fact, the initial comments that were made public were made to look like, statesmanship by both the leaders, which also plays well in to some extent to the domestic audience. But overall, if you see the trajectory, the power gap is narrowing between China and the US. The US is highly insecure about it being overtaken in most of the power indicators in the coming years and decades by China. Okay. So it's natural, the incumbent power will not want rising power to overtake it. So conflict, I think, is unavoidable. And all the flashpoints they talked about, you mentioned the domestic ones for China, on which they are very hypersensitive. The Chinese, apparently, Xi Jinping told Biden that you don't cross red lines and, don't play with fire on Taiwan, don't interfere, this is an internal affairs. So I think it was actually quite testy and heated. Okay. And that shows that great power relations today, they're saying managing the conflict, managing the competition, I think that's the most they can do. They cannot avoid it. And as we go forward, the structural realities underlying are such that China-US, you cannot expect anything but a clash.
Okay. Managing the competition is the best way to put it across, as you're pointing out, Dr. Cholia. Let me bring in Ambassador Meera Shankar here as well. Ambassador Shankar, in diplomacy, it is said that, it's good to have a dialogue, even if you are disagreeing. Until the time there is a dialogue, there is a possibility of finding a resolution to the problems as well. But, from your point of view, as Dr. Chawla is pointing out, this relationship is not only complex, but it's a conflicted one. And on various aspects, what are the key elements which you believe are the hotspots there?
Well, I think that it's a complex relationship because there are elements of competition, there are potential adversarial elements, and there are areas where they seek to work together. So I think I would call it one of increasing strategic competition, but also collaboration on certain global issues. And we have seen that in the recent climate change talks in Glasgow, where the US and China came up with a separate joint declaration saying that they would work together to on areas of climate change to keep global temperature rises within the 1.5 degree centigrade goal. Of course, it hasn't been fleshed out very much, the joint declaration, and neither the US nor China had agreed, along with India, to phase out coal and fossil fuels, which I think is a missed opportunity in a sense by the global community. But nevertheless, it shows that there are areas where the US and China will work together, and there are areas where they will compete. Particularly, I think technologically and economically, the competition is going to be fierce. And we've seen Biden impose sanctions on a range of US Chinese companies, 59 companies, on which American investment is now debarred. Because they say that these Chinese companies have very close links with the defense and security establishment in China. You've also seen more sanctions on human rights abuses against individuals who have been involved in human rights abuses in China, and counter sanctions by China on other individuals, particularly in Europe. And now you're seeing from Biden an effort to get his allies on board, the most recent being the NATO statement, which has said that Chinese behavior and aspirations are a challenge to the globe, to international order. Now, this is something new for NATO, which was always Russia-oriented, and is now looking at also countering Chinese behavior internationally to promote international rules-based order. So you are seeing both the elements of conflict, competition, and cooperation. I think one key flashpoint has been Taiwan. And partly, I think some of these conversations have been triggered by the possibility that this could emerge as a flashpoint.
We'll come to that. The Taiwan part, and obviously, the references which have been made by Joe Biden in his initial remarks to both Tibet as well as Hong Kong and Xinjiang. There, you're talking about the human rights issues. Let me bring in Elizabeth here, as you're pointing out, Mr. Shankar, that there are various issues for competition. There are various issues with convergence as well. And Dr. Chawla pointed out that this might be best termed as a conflicted relationship. Now, it is pretty much clear that fundamentally the United States and China both have different ways of looking at how to govern people and how to govern economies as well.
Well, absolutely. And I think if we look at the various complex relationships that have existed over the past few decades, especially during the Cold War, then back during the Cold War, the US managed, and the Soviet Union managed their very complex relationship where they had to, where they were clearly enemies, but also cooperated in some areas, for example, on research in the Arctic. But this relationship is so much more complex because there are so many more connection points between the two countries. Virtually every American company has some sort of activities in China, whether it be manufacturing in China, selling to China, or having Chinese companies in its supply chain. So it's far more complex even than that really complex relationship during the Cold War. And of course, we shouldn't forget that the climate is another key area where the two countries need to work together, or otherwise the rest of us are doomed. So it's people are saying, well, it wasn't this meeting wasn't exactly very successful. Well, I think it was a success that the two men met and had a conversation on not just on niceties, but on these various issues that the two countries do have to address together.
Okay, fair enough. Quite a lot of points there. You started with certain key ones. Both Mr. Shankar and Elizabeth have added more to it. But coming back to the key focus areas, and as both of them are pointing out, do you also agree that the three elements which will eventually have a lot of focus from both sides will be trade one, technology another, and obviously, the defense-related issues. There have already been questions which have been raised on China's nuclear stockpile. China has retorted, in a manner of its choosing to United States on that.
Yeah, you're right, Vishal. I mean, trade and technology are kind of like longer-term indicators of this competition. The geopolitical tussle is right now. I mean, the Indo Pacific Command of the US is there, and there is a cat and mouse game going on in the South China Sea, in the Western Pacific, even up to the Indian Ocean, where we are cooperating with the US and other Quad partners. One of the important points that apparently Xi Jinping raised today, and the Chinese media are giving that more prominence, is that he told the American counterparts that dividing the world into blocks is harmful and will lead to, is the greatest threat to peace. What they mean is that they don't want this US alliance system to try and contain China's rise, which is, of course, an old Cold War type strategy. So I think that's there. The geopolitics undeniably is a major, in fact, most of the tension and the news that we get comes from the geopolitical rivalry. But trade, the Trump-era sanctions, tariffs have not been lifted. Biden has not removed any of those, and the Chinese are hoping they will lift them. The Chinese think because of the inflation and the shortages in the US is now in a weaker bargaining position and will open up to Chinese goods. But I think that Americans want to drive a harder bargain. And technology, definitely the 5G, AI, all these fields, China is investing strategically. The gap is reducing. You see, every day, from an American point of view, if you're looking at it, it looks like if I don't act now, if I don't act urgently, they will not only catch up but overtake. And this is in the Chinese DNA. It's not only Xi Jinping, all the way back to Mao Zedong, 1950s, 1956, as early as that, the founder of the Chinese People's Republic was saying, we have to one day surpass the United States. So they have that, the gene for dominance and hegemony, which is creating a lot of anxiety and fear among the US allies in the region. So I think I see a clear division. Whether the Chinese like it or not, I think the division is inevitable because the Chinese are not stepping back. The Chinese said, we will establish a new model of major power relations. This was Xi Jinping when he met Obama in 2015. Even at that time, they were saying, we have to avoid conflict, we should not repeat Cold War, win-win. They use the sweet talk. But then when you look at the actions, the Chinese are actually relentlessly pursuing hegemony. So I think that is where the US has to draw a line. And if they don't allow, if they don't draw a line and say, okay, we'll coexist, you take one part of the world, we'll share another part of the world, I think that will lead to erosion of US power. So I think a lot of American elites, a lot of American strategic thinkers are highly worried. And I think the decisive time is now. There is a perception, especially among Republicans in the US, that Trump is soft, and that, Biden is soft compared to Trump, and that he needs to go harder at China. But I think the Biden strategy, at least what they say is, talk softly but carry a big stick and show the Chinese that we have an alliance system. And this is what is like the red rag to the bull. The Chinese get really mad because they don't want this alliance system to form to hem their rise. So I think that is the fundamental contradiction in the relationship.
And indeed, the US president did mention the allies at least more than once in his initial remarks there. That brings me to this important aspect, because this is really important to us as well, to India also. Mr. Shankar, and the President Biden did mention that in his initial remarks, that is, and the White House handout also mentions that is about Indo Pacific, the rule-based order, free and open Indo Pacific. There are a lot of emphasis on allies. And looking at it from India's point of view, this entire gamut of complex relationship between US and China, how does it, go for us?
Well, you see, China has been very assertive and even aggressive with all countries on its periphery, with whom it shares borders and with many of whom it has disputes, either maritime or land. And India has faced aggression by China on the border in little pockets. And the talks that we've been having with China haven't really yielded diplomatic results on the scale that India was expecting, in the sense that Chinese occupation of certain pockets continues and talks also continue. So for India, it's very important to establish systems and institutions which have the potential capacity of balancing China in Asia and ensuring that Asia is not under the hegemony of any one country, because that is crucial, as we see it, to peace and prosperity in the region. So for us, I think a robust American presence in Asia, and in terms of countering Chinese assertiveness through a range of actions, I think is important. We've seen also President Biden, assure Taiwan that it is committed under the Taiwan Act to come to Taiwan's defense should China seek to use force to unite Taiwan with China. And Chinese actions here, they have been systematically violating, with military aircraft, a large number, with ships, Taiwan waters and airspace. So I think this has emerged as a major flashpoint where both sides need to signal to each other that, they should not let it spill over into an actual conflict. I think that's one of the key signaling that has taken place during the talks between Biden and Xi, even though differences remain, because US recommitted to a one China policy. That means it recognizes the People's Republic of China as the China, but it also reiterated, guided by the Taiwan Relations Act, under which it is committed to come to Taiwan's defense.
Indeed.
So this is one area where US policy was more ambiguous earlier. It relied on strategic ambiguity, but where Biden has made a fairly clear statement a few months back that it is committed to come to Taiwan's defense. So in some sense, America is also signaling to China the need to pull back from this very aggressive behavior in Taiwan's waters as well as airspace.
Let me bring in Elizabeth here on this point. Elizabeth, obviously there are various flashpoints, and very nicely explained by Mr. Shankar as well, vis-a-vis what's happening there. In Taiwan Straits, one, Indo Pacific, another. But as Dr. Chauliya was pointing out, to understand it a little more clearly, there has been a lot of experts who pointed out that there's quite a lot of posturing which is taking place from both China and United States. Obviously, that happens between two, powers, world powers. But from the policy point of view, how is it going vis-a-vis President Biden's policy on China and what former President Trump was following? The trade sanctions obviously are a part of that. But apart from that, a lot of push needs to be given. That's what Dr. Chauliya is pointing out. Time is now for United States to act.
Yes, and I think now that we look back at President Trump's presidency, it was clearly chaotic for years, but people on both sides of the aisle in the US and across Europe and the rest of the world seem to be relieved that President Trump finally dared to articulate that China is behaving in a manner that's not beneficial to anybody and that is undermining the rules-based international order. And okay, Trump himself didn't exactly put America in a good light, but nevertheless, he dared to articulate this issue that many people have been thinking for themselves, but nobody dared to express publicly. Mm-hmm. And so now Biden can pull back on the rhetoric, but continue down the same path and present the same policies in a more palatable fashion, which is exactly what he's doing, because he has a lot of bipartisan support for exactly that. And I think this is actually the culmination of almost a decade of concerns, both among policymakers, but especially in the business community, that China is not acting, it's not playing fair in this globalized world, and it's unsustainable. And it's across the board. So if you look at its unfair business practices vis-a-vis other countries' companies, but also more geopolitically focused issues such as its construction of artificial islands in the South China Sea. Mm-hmm. It was very difficult for the neighbors and for the US to decide at any point, is this where we intervene? And in the end, there was no suitable point, and China has those islands. So clearly, the previous attitude of let's hope they just conform to international standards, it's not working anymore, and that's what Biden is trying to address now. Okay,
and clearly, that's what the United States and its allies have been time and again pointing out to China, that it should follow rule-based international order. Last question to you, Dr. Choliya, and coming back to how does it affect us, India? And Mr. Shankar was pointing out some aspects of it. This is really important because this is all happening in our backyard.
Yeah, if there is a new Cold War, and I think there is one, whether you want to call it one or not, I think we have to be geostrategically shrewder and take advantage of it. There's no question our alignment is with the US this time, and the Chinese know it. The Chinese are trying to pressurize on the border, saying you get away from the US and then we'll treat you better at the border. Look at the kind of blackmail tactics we are facing. So we cannot back away from this. This is an era of nationalism, hyper-nationalism. If Xi Jinping is nationalistic, Narendra Modi is also nationalistic. We are not going to back away from this. So I think we are getting ready for this long confrontation ourselves. And in the process, the US is going to matter a lot to us. And whatever minor differences we have with the US, I think we have to set them aside and focus on the big geopolitical challenge, which is that we have to counterbalance China. There's just no way. Dr. Jaishankar calls it rebalancing. We are all for it. And I think on that matter, the Chinese, we have to understand the Chinese mindset. There is a Chinese proverb, and they keep saying it. In the sun, in the horizon, there can be only one sun. Mm-hmm. There cannot be two. They don't want to share power with anybody. They don't believe in multipolar world order. India believes in multipolar world order. So there is a fundamental conflict in the way we look at the world. Our outlooks are different. So if the US is still willing to countenance India's rise because it's a democratic country. Indeed. And there's no clash of values. There's no threat to the Western values there. So I think India-US partnership will have to endure, and we have to take advantage of this. If we are saying if there is investment is moving away from China, then it will relocate to India, right? And there's a talk about a lot of the venture capitalists moving and reinvesting in India. Okay. So if there is a zero-sum game between China and the US, it's not harmful to us. Let's take advantage of it and let's benefit from it and maximize our gains, because we have to, if the Chinese want to catch up and overtake the US, one day our goal, our dream as Indian nationalists, we have to catch up with China and overtake China. Okay,
indeed, those are very, very important aspects there. Thank you so much, Dr. Choliya, Ms. Elizabeth Braw, and Mr. Meera Shankar as well for sharing your inputs and views on this very important aspect. And indeed, as our experts were pointing out, a very complex and conflicted relationship between these two powers, that is People's Republic of China and United States of America, with both those leaders putting across their own viewpoints. Once again, it is quite clear that there are various areas where both sides might agree to cooperate, but then there are various flashpoints as well. We'll come back again with a different topic. Till then, keep watching Sansad Television. Thank you.